On February 1st, 1968, the two giants of Eastern railroading, the 9,538-mile Pennsylvania Railroad and the 6,915-mile New York Central system, railroads that had been in competition for over a century, merged to become the Pennsylvania New York Central Transportation Company, which became known as the Penn Central. Pennsy and the New York Central came into the merger as profit-making railroads, but in little over 2 years, on June 21st, 1970, the Penn Central entered bankruptcy, at the time the largest American corporation to ever become bankrupt. Rail historians have offered numerous reasons for the failure of the merger: differences in corporate structure and operating philosophy, the tax burden of excess capacity, the general decline in the industrial output of the Northeast, the loss of passengers to airplanes and automobiles, the absorption of the bankrupt New Haven Railroad, an ICC requirement for approval of the merger, and possibly the most important factor, the lack of a comprehensive merger plan. However, it is likely that no single issue brought down the Penn Central, but rather a combination of factors, some known and others never identified. For whatever reason, in order to prevent the collapse of rail service in the Northeast, the federal government passed the Regional Rail Reorganization Act, and on April 1st, 1976, the Consolidated Rail Corporation, known as Conrail, took over operations of the Penn Central and 6 other northeastern railroads. At the time of the merger, the Penn Central combined roster included 4,411 locomotives from America's 5 major builders: the American Locomotive Company, known as ALCO, the Baldwin Locomotive Works, Locomotive Corporation, Fairbanks-Morse Company, General Electric, and the Lima Locomotive Works. The goal of this film is to provide a comprehensive review of the locomotives of the Penn Central from the date of the merger to the Conrail takeover. The locomotive numbers referenced in this film are based on a New York Central Pennsylvania Railroad renumbering program initiated prior to the merger, and subsequent renumberings made necessary by the acquisition of new motive power. During the planning stages of the proposed merger, the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroads agreed upon a renumbering system that would facilitate the merger, and both embarked upon engine renumbering. Even though the combined Penn Central roster at the time of the merger included over 4,000 diesel locomotives, there were a number of engines that were renumbered but never utilized in revenue service. The efficiencies resulting from the merger reduced the number of locomotives needed. As a result, older or inefficient motive power was put in storage, scrapped, or traded in for new locomotives. In order to provide the most inclusive look at the Penn Central, we will include all of the locomotives that were renumbered in the Penn Central system. The locomotive review will be by builder, beginning with Locomotive. This section will review Penn Central locomotives built by Locomotive. As was the case with most of the nation's Class I railroads, the Penn Central roster included more diesels from EMD than any other builder. It's a testimony not only to the quality of the product, but in a large part to the automotive-like mass production techniques, marketing, and product support system that General Motors brought to the railroad industry. The review will begin with cab units, followed by road switchers, then yard switchers, and finally passenger locomotives. There were 4 models of Locomotive cab units renumbered into the Penn Central roster: F3s and F7s, dual-purpose FP7s, and the unusual FL9s inherited from the New Haven Railroad. The F3s, although renumbered, were traded into EMD for second-generation Jeeps and never repainted. There were over 400 F7s that were renumbered, but like the F3s, they became trade-ins on newer power. When the Penn Central was absorbed into Conrail, only 105 remained in operation. Even though operating records indicate that the Penn Central concentrated the F units in the Cleveland area, At times they could be seen in other locations, as evidenced by these two photographs of an F-7A unit and an F-7B unit, photographs taken in July of 1975 in Chicago. Almost a year later, in April of 1976, another F-7, number 1807, had traveled west and was photographed in the freight yard in Chicago. In these next two photographs, both taken in Collinwood, Ohio in August of 1973, we see 1709 and 1686 coupled to a sister unit. The engines were sitting outside the servicing area. F-7 number 721, shown here in a photograph taken in September of 1970 in Chicago, was part of a 4-unit ABBA set of F-7s acquired from the Denver and Rio Grande Western. For rail fans that enjoyed seeing and photographing first-generation diesels, the Penn Central following the merger provided many opportunities. In this photograph we see F-7 number 1756 at the head end of a 7-unit first-generation lash-up, which included 3 F-7A units and 4 of the relatively rare cabless GP9B units. The Penn Central roster included 40 Locomotive dual-purpose FP7s. Visually, the FP7 was almost identical to the F7, except that the FP7 was 4 foot longer. As shown, 4 feet was added to the locomotive behind the first porthole to provide space for the steam-generating components necessary for passenger operations. In these next two photographs, taken in Crestline, Ohio in August of 1973, we see number 4365 and 4369 sitting on the ready track in the freight yard waiting for their next assignment. 15 of the FP7s were still in revenue service at the time of the Conrail takeover. In the final FP7 photograph, we see number 4340 as the trailing unit on an eastbound freight out of Dalton, Illinois in December of 1974. 60 former New Haven FL9s were absorbed into the Penn Central. The FL9s, because of the uniqueness of their design, the ability to operate as a diesel-electric or as a straight electric locomotive for the run into New York's Grand Central Station, remained on the roster and were in active service. In this first photograph, taken in 1968, shortly after the merger, we see that the Penn Central was utilizing the FL9s on passenger service before they were repainted. Number 5006 is still in its New Haven livery with a Penn Central logo painted on the side. The Penn Central did begin to repaint the FL9s in the standard all-black paint scheme. However, in July of 1970, the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority, which subsidized Penn Central's former New York Central commuter routes, acquired new passenger equipment. They requested the Penn Central to repaint the 28 FL9s used in their trains with a brighter color to complement the new equipment. The result was a handsome design with a bright yellow nose, dark blue sides with a bright yellow Penn Central logo. Unfortunately, the paint didn't stand up and the yellow faded to a white or light gray as seen in this photograph. The temperature was well over 90 degrees in August of 1974 when we took this photograph at the station in Poughkeepsie, New York. It seemed to us that the engine crew was looking for a way to provide some additional ventilation. But who knows, maybe the door was broken. In this photograph, also taken in Poughkeepsie, New York in 1974, we get an opportunity to see the pickup shoes that were mounted both on the 3-axle rear truck and the standard 2-axle lead truck. The pickup shoes allowed the FL9 to operate as a straight electric in the New York electric zone where there was a third rail, paralleling each of the tracks. It is interesting to note that of the 60 FL9s absorbed into the Penn Central, 43 remained in passenger service into the mid-1990s, operated by Amtrak and in regional commuter service. 22 of the FL9s were rebuilt and remained in service after the turn of the century. They were thought to be the last electromotive cab units in day-to-day operation anywhere in the nation. There were 14 models of electromotive road switchers on the Penn Central roster, from the earliest GP7s, inherited both from the Pennsy and the New York Central, to the GP40s and ST38s that were purchased after the merger. Most of the EMD road switchers remained in revenue service until the Conrail takeover. In the following films and photographs, we will see these units in action all across the Penn Central system. In this first GP7 photograph, taken in Chicago, Illinois in August of 1973, we get up close to number 5665, a former New York Central unit. One of the identifying features in the as-delivered GP7s were the 3 battery box louvers located under the cab. Number 5665 still has the as-delivered 3 ventilation louvers. It was not unusual for the railroads to remove one or more of the louvered panels during maintenance. So as the engines got older, many GP7s gave the appearance of the GP9, which was delivered with only a single or no battery box louver. One of the standard options offered by Electromotive on the GP7 was an oversized fuel tank allowing for long-distance operation. The oversized fuel tank was mounted below the frame between the 2 trucks. The oversized fuel tank necessitated the relocation of the air compressor tanks to the top of the long hood. Rail fans of the time, many of whom had come through World War II, thought that the air compressor tubes on top of the locomotive resembled the torpedo tubes mounted on the deck of the Navy's famous PT boats. So rail fans began calling Jeeps with this alternative torpedo boats. In these next 2 film clips, we see GP7s switching passenger cars outside Chicago's Union Station in 1973. It was somewhat unusual to see a unit without a steam generator assigned to terminal switching duties. Number 5898 was not equipped with a steam generator. This was evidenced by the lack of a stack above the short hood where the steam generators were located on GP7s. Number 5953 was one of the units identified as a torpedo boat. As the camera pans the engineer's side in number 7057, we see the single battery box ventilation unit under the cab, an identifying feature of the GP9. The bulges on top of the long hood, identified as blisters, were an indication that number 7057 was delivered with dynamic brakes. In these next 2 GP9 photographs taken in Princeton Junction, New Jersey, the first in October of 1973 and the second in March of 1974, we see GP9s at the head end of eastbound freights. In both cases, the engines are running long hood first. The engine terminal in the former Pennsylvania Railroad freight yard in Chicago, Illinois, was a good location to photograph Penn Central locomotives. In these next 2 photographs, both taken in August of 1973, we see a couple of GP9s having completed their service and ready for their next assignment. Number 7429, a former New York Central Jeep, had been hauling freight for 14 years when this photograph was taken in Buffalo, New York in September of 1971. The GP20, first introduced in November of 1959, was Locomotive's first turbocharged road switcher, and was the last model produced with a variation of the original GP7 car body. 260 Jeep 20s were built for American railroads. 214 of the 260 units were delivered with a low short hood, a feature becoming popular with the railroads because of the improved visibility. The main identifying feature of the GP20 was the turbocharger exhaust stack, located on the long hood, immediately behind the ventilator fan located to the rear of the cab. Number 2112, idles ready for its next assignment in Kingston, New York, in this August of 1974 photograph. Number 2112 was one of 15 GP20s built for the New York Central Railroad without dynamic brakes, the only GP20s built without this feature. GP20 number 2104 is doing some mainline switching in this Kingston, New York photograph, again taken in August of 1974. Locomotive's 2250 horsepower GP30, with the large blisters on top of the cab running along the long hood, was easily identifiable. No other Jeep looked anything like it. The passenger platform at Princeton Junction, New Jersey, was an ideal location to photograph the Penn Central. In these next three photographs, taken in the early 1970s, we see Jeep 30s at the head ends of eastbound freights. It was May of 1973 when this photograph was taken in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. In 1973, with the signing of a waiver, it was easy to obtain access to the locomotive servicing areas. In this 1974 film clip, we see a single GP30 highballing a freight, passing the commuter train which was making the scheduled stop. In our final GP30 film clip, we again see a single unit heading eastbound with a freight through Princeton Junction, New Jersey. In this April of 1971 photograph, we see GP35 number 2351 leading a sister unit and a trailing GP30 at the head end of an eastbound piggyback freight, highballing through Princeton Junction, New Jersey. Number 2397 is the lead unit on a freight heading eastbound from the freight yards in Chicago, Illinois. The photograph was taken in August of 1970. GP38, number 7754, was one of 265 of these 2,000 horsepower road switchers that were purchased by the Penn Central shortly after the merger. The first units were delivered in 1969. It's a little unusual to see a second-generation Jeep being spun on a turntable, equipment that was normally associated with steam locomotives. This film clip was shot in May of 1973 in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. Number 7695 was sitting on the ready tracks at the freight yard in Chicago, Illinois when this photograph was taken in April of 1976. The GP38 is similar in appearance to Locomotive's other early second-generation diesels. However, the GP38 was a normally aspirated engine and therefore lacked the turbocharger stack. In addition, it was 3 feet longer than the GP28. We're back in Princeton Junction, New Jersey for the next 3 photographs of GP38s in action. The photographs were all taken in the early 1970s, in summer and winter. Number 2013 is leaving the freight yard in Burlington, New Jersey with a caboose in tow in this August of 1972 photograph. Both 2013 and number 2010, shown here in Camden, New Jersey in September of 1976, were former Pennsylvania Reading seashore units, as evidenced by the extended cabs. GP38s were not normally associated with passenger movements because they lacked steam generators. However, in this November of 1974 photograph, we see number 7973 doing some terminal switching in Rensselaer, New York. In this final GP38 photograph, we see number 8101 as the lead unit on a freight, waiting for clearance to head eastbound out of the freight yard in Chicago, Illinois. The photograph was taken in December of 1974. In this final film clip, we see a GP38 leading 2 General Electric U-boats as the head-end power on a westbound freight, heading through Princeton Junction, New Jersey. When this film clip was taken in 1976, there was still a caboose at the tail end of every freight train. Locomotive GP40s were another class of locomotives purchased by the Penn Central after the merger. 170 of the 3,000 horsepower Jeeps were purchased. The first joined the roster in 1970. In this August of 1970 photograph, we see GP40 number 3172 sitting on the ready track in the freight yard in Chicago, Illinois. As the camera zooms in on the rear of the long hood, we see the distinguishing feature of the GP40. There were 3 ventilator fan housings grouped together at the rear of the long hood. It is also interesting to note the 2-tone Penn Central logo. A few of the earliest Penn Central repaints, as well as the earliest new deliveries, had this alternative. Once again, Princeton Junction, New Jersey is the backdrop for a film clip and a series of photographs of GP40s, all taken in the early 1970s. Locomotive introduced the SD, special duty, locomotives with the SD7 in May of 1951. The unit was a stretched GP7 with 6-axle flexicoil trucks, an enlarged radiator system, and an additional roof fan. The diesel-electric system, providing juice to 6 traction motors rather than 4, combined with the increased cooling capacity, resulted in a high-adhesion locomotive especially designed for low-speed, heavy hauling. Locomotive sent an SD on a demonstration tour. The unit, numbered 990, exceeded the design goals. It demonstrated the ability to haul long trains on level ground, climb steep grades, and even led passenger runs and transfer freight. It also spent time as a yard switcher and a hump engine. In addition, its weight distribution allowed it to operate on light rail branch lines and other areas of restricted wheel loadings. Even though the demonstration was highly successful, the early SD units were outsold by conventional Jeeps at a ratio of nearly 8-to-1. 4-motor units continued to outsell the SD types until the late 1960s, when their higher horsepower locomotives necessitated the use of 6-axle trucks. However, it can be said that these early six-motor locomotives were the genesis of today's superpower. The Penn Central had 40 of Locomotive SD35s on the roster. They were originally purchased by the Pennsylvania Railroad in February of 1965. In this September of 1970 photograph taken in Chicago, Illinois, we see number 6019 as the lead unit on an eastbound freight. SD35 number 6010 leads a trio of second-generation road switchers on a freight through Mooresville, Pennsylvania in September of 1976. Number 6031 was long overdue for a meeting at the wash rack when this photograph was taken in October of 1976. Locomotive had the SD38 in its catalog from May of 1967 to October of 1971. However, it was not a big seller. Only 52 were sold to American railroads. More than half the units sold, a total of 35, were purchased by the Penn Central in 1970, 2 years after the merger. It is interesting to note that the SD38 was built on the same frame as the SD45 that had a longer body. The result was an extended open area at the end of the long hood. This became known as the porch. In this winter of 1976 film clip, we see an SD38 running long hood first at the head end of a mixed freight, working its way through the south side of Chicago. The Penn Central had 65 of Locomotive SD40s on the roster, all former Pennsylvania units. They were purchased by the Pennsylvania Railroad in February and March of 1966, 2 years before the merger. The 3 ventilator fan housings at the end of the long hood were the identifying feature of the SD40, as they were with the GP40. It was a cloudy day in August of 1973 when SD40 6260 went eastbound out of the freight yard in Chicago, Illinois. In this film clip, shot in Princeton Junction, New Jersey on a rainy afternoon in July of 1976, we see a pair of Penn Central SD40s heading eastbound with a mixed freight. Locomotive's 3,600 horsepower SD45 was the highest horsepower 6-axle road switcher available when it was introduced in 1966. The Pennsylvania Railroad was an early buyer of the SD45. The first units of Pennsylvania's order for 135 SD45s were delivered in October of 1966. All 135 of the SD45s were absorbed into the Penn Central roster. The primary identifying feature of the SD45 were the flared radiator housings at the end of each side of the long hood. The flared sides were made necessary by the larger cooling system required for the 3,600 horsepower prime mover. There were 8 classifications of Locomotive yard switchers on the Penn Central roster, the first of which were the SW1s, the original units having been delivered in 1943. All of the end cab yard switchers, except for 89 SW1500s, purchased between 1970 and 1973, were inherited at the time of the merger. The Penn Central roster included 190 Locomotive SW1s. 105 came from the New York Central, and 85 were from the Pennsy. The earliest of the SW1s were New York Central units that were delivered in August of 1941. The main identifying features of the SW1 were the short hood, the single stack, and the rounded sandbox mounted on the frame just in front of the hood. SW1s could be seen in freight yards all across the system. In this photograph, we see number 8576 in Philadelphia in December of 1974. In October of 1949, Locomotive introduced the SW7. The SW7 had 1,200 horsepower, twice that of the SW1. 115 SW7s were renumbered into the Penn Central numbering scheme. 71 came from the New York Central, and 41 were from the Pennsylvania Railroad. The first three photographs were all of number 8837. 8837 was assigned to the Bristol, Pennsylvania freight yard. The SW7 could also be seen switching yards all across the system. Number 8929 is busy in Collinwood, Ohio in this August of 1973 photograph. The identifying features on the SW7 were two exhaust stacks centered on the hood, a large front grille that extended all the way down to the frame, and 6 rows of louvers along the sides of the hood. The SW8 was an 800 horsepower end cab yard switcher. Its identifying features were a single stack and 8 vertical louvers along the sides of the hood. 26 SW8s were renumbered into the Penn Central system. All were former New York Central units. The SW9, like the SW7, was rated at 1,200 horsepower. However, Locomotive considered it an upgrade because the SW9 came with an improved 12-cylinder prime mover. Locomotive introduced the 900 horsepower SW900 in January of 1954 and built 260 for American railroads. The SW900 was a rare locomotive for the Penn Central. There were only 3 on the roster, numbered 8628 to 8630. Former New York Central locomotives. In this photograph taken in August of 1973, we see number 8628 idling in the freight yard in Collinwood, Ohio. There were 55 SW1200s on the Penn Central roster, 35 former Pensa units and 20 from the New Haven. The SW1200 was also rated at 1,200 horsepower. Once again, Locomotive considered the unit as an upgrade because of the improvements made to the prime mover. Number 9187, shown here in this August of 1974 photograph, taken in Springfield, Massachusetts, is a former New Haven unit. The 20 former New Haven SW1200s could be identified by the Flexicoil trucks. The 1,500 horsepower SW1500 was the last of the traditional Locomotive end cab yard switchers. Penn Central purchased 89 of these units that were delivered between 1970 and 1973. The only yard switchers purchased after the merger. The SW1500, with its tall cab and shallow roof curb, was easily identifiable. Number 9227 looks virtually new in this photograph taken in August of 1973. It's switching the freight yards in Chicago. The review of Locomotive end cab yard switchers will conclude with the NW2. There were 84 NW2s renumbered into the Penn Central numbering system. 32 came from the Pennsylvania Railroad and 52 from the New York Central. The earliest of the NW2s were Pennsylvania units that were delivered in November of 1945, just after the end of World War II. The identifying features of the NW2 were the half radiator in the front of the unit and a double taper where the hood unit met the cab. The Penn Central hauled all of its non-New Haven passenger trains exclusively with Locomotive E7s and E8s. There were 267 Locomotive E units renumbered into the Penn Central system. There were 81 E7A units, 42 E7B units, and 134 E8A units. The E7s and E8s were similar in appearance. The main identifying feature, as shown in this illustration, is that the E8 had a continuous stainless steel grille along the top of the hood on both sides of the locomotive. Immediately following the merger, before the Penn Central began to eliminate passenger service, railfans could find E7s and E8s virtually anywhere on the system. In the following films and photographs, we'll take a look at the E units in action. South Amboy, New Jersey in the 1970s was a good place to photograph the Penn Central. In this first film clip, we see an E7 and two E8s on a passenger train. In the second, an E8 sandwiched between two E7A units. There were 5 E units led by an E7 on this passenger train as it highballed past Princeton Junction, New Jersey in March of 1973. Back in South Amboy, New Jersey in August of 1973, we see an E7 and an E8 coupled together. Once again in South Amboy, New Jersey, this time in March of 1973, we see 2 E7s on the head end of a 3-car passenger train. The E7s provided plenty of power to keep that train on schedule. Amtrak purchased 70 E8s from the Penn Central. Amtrak's original plans were to have all units repainted by the summer of 1973. It was obvious they didn't meet that schedule, because in April of 1975 we see E8 number 4062 still in its Penn Central livery. The photograph was taken in the Amtrak engine servicing area just south of Chicago's Loop. Throughout the early 1970s, South Amboy and Princeton Junction, New Jersey, were ideal locations to photograph E units in operation. In our final E8 photograph, we see 3 E8s highballing through Elberon, New Jersey in May of 1976. This section on Penn Central Locomotive E units will conclude with 3 film clips shot in the middle 1970s showing Locomotive E8s on the lead tracks just south of Chicago's Union Station. This section will review Penn Central locomotives constructed by ALCO. At the time of the merger, all ALCO passenger units were off the roster. Our detailed review of Penn Central roster information indicated at least one FA freight type cab unit number 1300 was repainted Penn Central. Number 1300 is not included in our film library, so we will begin the detailed review with road switchers. There were 17 classifications of ALCO road switchers on the combined roster. Our review will begin with the RS-1. There were 40 RS-1s on the combined roster. 14 were original New York Central locomotives and 26 came from the Pennsylvania Railroad. The first 3 RS-1 photographs were taken in Bristol, Pennsylvania over a 2-year period. Number 9923 was photographed in July of 1971. 9938 the September of the same year, and 9904 in November of 1973. These early ALCOs had been in service for more than 20 years when these photographs were taken. The final RS-1 photograph, number 9902, was taken in Mooresville, Pennsylvania in April of 1976. The RS-1s, aside from the new paint scheme, retained their original as-delivered appearance. ALCO introduced the 1600 horsepower RS-3 in May of 1950. There were 1,265 RS-3s constructed for American railroads during its 6-year production run. The Penn Central combined roster included 391 RS-3s. 143 came from the New York Central, 117 came from the Pennsylvania Railroad, and 41 came from the New Haven. Number 5352, shown here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a photograph taken in October of 1974, was a former New York Central locomotive, joining the Central roster in September of 1953. In these next two photographs, both taken in August of 1974, you see number 5456, photographed in Washington, D.C., and number 5501, photographed in Cape Charles, Virginia. '96 ALCO RS-3s were re-engined with prime movers salvaged from scrapped E-units. They were given the roster identification of RS-3M, M being for modified. The RS-3Ms were identifiable by the boxy exhaust structure added to the top of the long hood. The units were downgraded to 1,200 horsepower from their original 1,600 and were used in secondary freight and passenger service. In February of 1956, ALCO introduced the RS-11. It was the first total redesign of the original Road Switcher series. The RS-1, 2, and 3 shared the same general body and many of the same components. The RS-11 had a box-like appearance and was identifiable by the deep notches in the hood ends for the number boards. ALCO found the box-like shape to be flexible, and all future ALCO road switchers retained the RS-11's general form. In this October of 1973 photograph, taken in Penn Central's Camden, New Jersey freight yard, we see number 7621 sitting near the engine servicing facilities. It's April of 1971, and this RS-11 is showing off its ability to smoke like a steam engine. Because of ALCO's prime mover's tendency to smoke under high stress, rail fans gave the ALCOs the title of honorary steam engine. In this November of 1973 photograph, we see 7617 running westbound with a freight through Princeton Junction, New Jersey. It's June of 1973, and RS-11 number 7618 is doing a little street running through Burlington, New Jersey. It's interesting to note that 7618 is running long hood first. As seen in this illustration, the RS-11 was introduced to bring ALCO into competition with its rivals. Up until 1956, ALCO was the last in the horsepower race. The RS-11's 1,800 horsepower made it only second to the Fairbanks-Morse Trainmaster. By 1959, EMD had upped its road switcher power to 2,000 with the introduction of the turbocharged GP20, and General Electric introduced the 2,500 horsepower U25B. In response, ALCO offered the 2,400 horsepower RS-27. The RS-27 retained the same general box-like shape of the RS-11. However, the cab was moved forward, resulting in a more stubby appearance of the short hood. All of the R-27s were delivered with a lowered short hood for better visibility. The notches were retained on the short, low hood, even though the number boards were mounted above the windshield. The RS-27 was a rare locomotive. Only 27 were constructed by ALCO. In June of 1961, ALCO introduced the 2,000 horsepower RS-32. A total of 35 RS-32s were built, of which 25 were purchased by the New York Central and remained on the Penn Central roster, numbered 2020 to 2044. Because of its unusual design characteristics with the extended, lowered, short hood, rail fans identified the RS-32 as an alligator. The Penn Central inherited 4 models of ALCO's first-generation 6-axle road switchers identified as RSDs. ALCO built 167 of the 1,600 horsepower RSD5s for American railroads between 1952 and 1956. There were 6 RSD5s on the Penn Central roster. Here we see number 6805 as the middle unit on an eastbound New Jersey freight. There were 25 of the 1,800 horsepower RSD-12s on the Penn Central roster. They were numbered 6855 to 6879. The RSD-12s were former Pennsy units that retained their original numbers. Number 6879, shown here in a 1973 photograph heading westbound through Princeton Junction, New Jersey, was the final RSD-12 delivered to the Pennsy. It joined the Pennsylvania roster in April of 1958. Number 6866 was photographed in Morrisville, Pennsylvania in September of 1973. Visually, aside from the 6-motor trucks, it is virtually identical to the RS-11. Number 6877 is demonstrating its honorary steam status as it heads eastbound through Princeton Junction, New Jersey, in this June of 1973 photograph. In these film clips, shot in 1974 in Camden, New Jersey, we see number 6871 performing switching duties. ALCO introduced the RSD-15 in February of 1956. They built 87 during its construction period from 1956 to 1960. The Penn Central had 5 of these big 2,400 horsepower ALCO road switchers. They were former Pennsylvania units numbered 8611 to 8616. The first 2 numbers were reversed on the Penn Central, and the units became 6811 to 6816. It was a sunny but very cold day in February of 1976 when number 6816 was photographed in Camden, New Jersey. Number 6812 was sitting on the ready track just outside the engine servicing facilities in Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania in this November of 1973 photograph. It's doubtful in this post-9/11 world that any of the existing major railroads would give permission for rail fans to walk through the engine servicing facilities and get this close to the locomotives. In January of 1963, ALCO introduced its Century 424, the first in a new series of road switchers. With the major dieselization of the railroads completed by the early 1950s, ALCO's market share greatly diminished. By 1959, Lima, Baldwin, and Fairbanks-Morse had stopped locomotive construction, and ALCO was a distant third in its competition with EMD and General Electric. The Century Series was ALCO's last attempt to compete in the locomotive construction business. In October of 1964, ALCO introduced the second of its Century Series, the 425, that increased the horsepower to 2,500. The Century units were a redesigned locomotive that featured transistorized electrical controls, a pressurized cab and body that eliminated louvers and filter openings, and a high-adhesion truck design. In this August of 1973 photograph, we get a close-up of C425 number 2420. It is one of 26 of the Century 425s that the Penn Central had on its roster. Number 2428 is the lead unit in this 4-unit lash-up, highballing a westbound freight along the main line in New Jersey. In July of 1966, ALCO increased the horsepower of its Century series with the introduction of the C430. The first two C430 photographs were taken in Mingo Junction, Ohio in 1974. In the first photograph, we see number 2051 as the lead unit on a westbound freight. Number 2053, sitting on the ready track, provides an opportunity to get a closer look at the details of the locomotive. ALCO developed a simplified numbering process for its Century locomotives. The first number in the 3-number sequence indicates the number of axles. The second two numbers are the horsepower. For example, the Century 430 had 4 power axles and 3,000 horsepower. The Penn Central had 10 Century 430s on its roster. They were numbered 2050 to 2059. In this photograph, we see number 2056 at the head end of a eastbound freight, highballing through the New Jersey countryside. Number 2054 is the lead unit on a coal train, slowly moving upgrade through Weirton Junction, West Virginia. The photograph was taken in July of 1976. ALCO also developed 6 motor versions of its Century series, 3 of which were included on the Penn Central roster: the C628, 630, and 636. ALCO introduced the 2,750 horsepower Century 628 in December of 1963. ALCO built 135 units for American Railroad during its construction run from 1963 to 1968. There were 15 Century 628s on the Penn Central roster, numbered 6300 to 6314. They were former Pennsy units with the same numbers. ALCO's Century 628 was a massive-looking locomotive, as seen in this photograph of number 6310, taken in Cottonwood, Ohio, in August of 1973. ALCO continued to increase the horsepower of its Century series, and in July of 1965 introduced the Century 630 with 3,000 horsepower. Penn Central's C630s were former Pennsylvania Railroad units. The Pennsy had 15 on the roster. Visually, the C30s were very similar to the C28s, except for the aftercooler box, which was mounted on top of the long hood immediately in back of the cab. 6327 was photographed in Collinwood, Ohio, in August of 1973. It was sitting on the ready track, waiting for its next assignment. The final locomotive in the Century series was the Century 636, 3,600 horsepower unit, introduced in December of 1967. Penn Central's Century 636s, like the 630s, were former Pennsylvania units. Visually, the Century 636 was similar to the 630, except for the box structure on the roof near the end of the long hood, just above the PC logo. Number 6331 was posing in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania freight yard engine servicing area when this photograph was taken in October of 1974. The review of ALCO Penn Central locomotives will conclude with yard switchers. As seen on the illustration, there were 5 models of ALCO yard switchers operated by the Penn Central. There were 4 of the S series from S1 to S4, and also the T6, which was a yard switcher with road trucks and used for transfer purposes. ALCO introduced the 660 horsepower S1 in April of 1940. 539 were sold during the production period from April of 1940 to June of 1950. There were 82 S1s on the Penn Central roster. 40 were inherited from the New Haven Railroad, and 42 came from the Pennsy. Number 9452, shown here performing switching duties in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in December of 1972, was a former Pennsy unit. It joined the Pennsylvania roster in March of 1949. Number 9463 is also a former Pennsylvania switcher. It was also assigned to the Philadelphia Freight Yard when this photograph was taken in February of 1973. At the same time ALCO introduced the S1, it introduced the S2, which was a turbocharged version of the S1, producing 1,000 horsepower. Although it was basically the same locomotive, there were several external features that identified the turbocharged S2. The basic differences were that the S2 had a large square radiator shutter in the front and a larger stack with a triangular base to accommodate the turbocharged system. The S2 proved to be more popular. ALCO sold over 1,500 units. The Penn Central had 155 S2s on the roster. 11 came from the New Haven, 54 from the Pennsy, and 89 from the New York Central. Number 9619, shown here in Bristol, Pennsylvania in September of 1971, is a former New York Central unit. Number 9782 is at the head end of a local freight heading westbound through Princeton Junction, New Jersey in June of 1973. In this August of 1974 photograph, taken in the former Cedar Hill, New Haven yard, we get an above view of an ALCO S2 yard switcher sitting on the ready track waiting for its next assignment. In March of 1950, ALCO introduced the 660 horsepower S3 and at the same time a 1,000 horsepower turbocharged version of the locomotive. The same procedure it had used with the introduction of the S1 and S2. Visually, the two units were separated by the same visual characteristics as the S1, S2. Once again, the 1,000 horsepower version, the S4, was more popular than the S3. 799 S4s were built versus 292 of the 660 horsepower S3. S3 number 9349 is shown here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The photograph was taken in December of 1972. The final locomotive in our Penn Central ALCO series is the T6. ALCO introduced the T6 in March of 1958. The T6 was basically a yard switcher type locomotive. It was identifiable by the notches on the top of the hood, similar to those included on the RS-11. The T6 had 1,000 horsepower and was equipped with transition-type controls, not normally found on yard-switching locomotives. Only 55 were sold in the United States, of which 5 were on the Pennsy roster. Number 9849 is a former Pennsy unit, and it's shown here in Bristol, Pennsylvania in August of 1971. This section will review Penn Central locomotives constructed by the Baldwin Locomotive Works and the Lima Hamilton Corporation. Beginning with those constructed by Baldwin. The Penn Central roster at the time of the merger included over 4,000 diesel locomotives, of which less than 10% were built by Baldwin. 422 Baldwin diesels were renumbered into the Penn Central system, but only 404 made it to the merger date. There were 45 road switchers and 359 yard switchers on the combined Penn Central roster. 18 Baldwin New York Central RF-16 Shark-Nose cab units were renumbered, but were traded into General Electric before the merger date. As indicated earlier, the review will include all locomotives that were renumbered into the Penn Central system. We will begin with the RF-16 cab units. The RF-16s were New York Central engines. In 1967, they were among a group of locomotives the New York Central traded into General Electric just before the merger. General Electric received an offer from the Monongahela Railroad, a Pennsylvania short line centered near South Brownsville, and sold 7 of the RF-16s, number 1205, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13, and 16, to the Monongahela. After 5 years of operation in 1972, the Monongahelias sold the RS-16s for scrap. 2 of them, number 1205 and 1216, were rescued from the scrap heap and purchased by the Delaware and Hudson. These 2 were the last 2 RF-16 shark-nose cab units in existence. The Delaware and Hudson rebuilt them, and they looked brand new in their blue, silver, and gold paint scheme that looks surprisingly like the Santa Fe war bonnet. The Delaware and Hudson operated the engines until 1974. In 1974, they were bought by a private owner and leased to the Michigan Northern, a Michigan short line operating in north and northeastern Michigan. The Michigan Northern operated them in freight service until major mechanical problems took them from the rails. As of 2006, they were stored unserviceable and inaccessible to the public on the Escanaba and Lake Superior Railroad in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. There were 4 models of Baldwin road switchers on the Penn Central roster: the DRS 441,000, the DRS 441500, the RS-12, and the AS-616. It is interesting to note that the earliest of the Baldwin road switchers carried the designation DRS, which stood for diesel road switchers, the reason being that at the time Baldwin was still producing steam locomotives. In these next 2 photographs, taken in Camden, New Jersey in April of 1973, we see number 8300 idling on the ready track, waiting for its next assignment. Baldwin built the 1200 horsepower RS-12 from 1951 to 1956. 46 were constructed for American railroads, of which 17 went to the New York Central and 6 were purchased by the Pennsylvania. In June of 1973, Baldwin RS-12, number 8306, was assigned to the Camden, New Jersey freight yard. In these 3 photographs, we see it performing switching duties. The most successful locomotive in Baldwin's road switcher program was the 1600 horsepower 6-axle AS-616. 148 were built between 1950 and 1954. 12 of the AS-616s were renumbered in the Penn Central numbering system, but within a year of the merger, only 5 were still operational, including number 6974. The Penn Central had 6 models of Baldwin yard switchers on the roster: the DS44660, the DS44750, the DS441,000, the VO1000, the S8, and the S12. During its 20 years of yard switcher production, Baldwin sold just under 2,000 units. The 2 1,000 horsepower switchers, the DS441,000 and the VO1000, were the most popular. There were 89 Baldwin DS44660 yard switchers on the combined Penn Central roster. In these next series of photographs, all taken in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, between December of 1972 and May of 1974, we see 4 examples of Penn Central Baldwin DS44660s, number 8371, 8374, 8350, and 8369. The units were all assigned to the Penn Central Freight Yard. Penn Central had 132 Baldwin DS-44-1000s on the combined roster. During the early 1970s, the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Freight Yard was home to Baldwin end-cab yard switchers. These two photographs of number 8268 were taken in December of 1972. At the same time, the pictures of the DRS-44660s were taken. Number 8264 was also assigned to Philadelphia when this photograph was taken in April of 1973. Philadelphia was not the only location where the Baldwins were working in the 1970s. The snowy cold conditions in February of 1972 didn't affect the operation of number 7952 as it was performing its switching duties in the Camden, New Jersey freight yard. The 1200 horsepower S-12 was the final yard switcher produced by Baldwin. Its production period was from 1951 until close of business in 1956. During that time, a total of 449 were constructed. The Penn Central combined roster included 108 Baldwin S-12 yard switchers. In this film clip and following photograph, both taken in August of 1972, we see S-12 number 8100s switching the Camden, New Jersey yard. '8318 was also working Camden when these two photographs were taken, also in 1972. S-12s number 8319 and 8321 joined their sister Baldwins in working the Philadelphia yard in the 1970s. Number 8326, the Camden, New Jersey freight yard, and was idling between assignments as it posed for this pan view. This section will close with a review of Penn Central locomotives built by Lima. The Lima Locomotive Works was best known for high-speed, high-horsepower steam locomotives. Lima didn't begin producing diesel locomotives until 1947 when it merged with the Hamilton Corporation, a builder of diesel engines. The first locomotive, a diesel switcher, was produced in 1949. Lima built diesel locomotives for only a 3-year period when it was absorbed into the Baldwin Locomotive Works. During the 3-year production period, only 200 diesel locomotives were built. The New York Central was the only railroad to purchase Lima road switchers. 16 1200 horsepower locomotives, identified by Lima as light road switchers, were delivered to the New York Central in 1950. All but 2 were removed from the roster prior to the merger. In these 3 photographs, we see number 8399, one of the former New York Central Lima road switchers. As indicated by the modified exhaust structure on the top of the long hood, the locomotive was re-engined by Locomotive. The New York Central Lima road switchers were favorites of the Chicago rail fans and could be seen switching the LaSalle Street station for the New York Central. In these three film clips, shot in the 1960s, we see the Lima road switchers in action. The Limas had been re-engined by Locomotive in the late 1950s, so the modified exhaust structure can already be seen in these 1960s film clips. Anyone who was rail fanning in Chicago in the 1960s will recognize that these film clips were shot off the Roosevelt Road Bridge, undoubtedly Chicago's best location for photographing passenger operations. This section will review Penn Central locomotives built by the Fairbanks-Morse Corporation and by General Electric. There were two classes of Fairbanks-Morse road switchers, the H1644 and the H2044, and two classes of Fairbanks-Morse yard switchers, the 81044 and the 81244, that were renumbered into the Penn Central system. But only one class, the H1644, was actually repainted and operated after the merger. Fairbanks-Morse H16-44, number 5172, is idling among other Penn Central power in the September of 1970 photograph, taken in Chicago, Illinois. This section will review diesel-electric locomotives built by General Electric. GE's electric locomotives will be covered in the following section. The oldest GE diesel on the Penn Central roster was number 9999, a 44-ton center cab switcher designed for one-man operation on the common carrier railroads. Number 9999 was a former Pensa unit, one of 45 originally delivered between 1947 and 1949. It was the only 44-ton GE that was renumbered, repainted, and operated by the Penn Central. The other GE diesel locomotives on the Penn Central roster were 10 classifications of road switchers. General Electric, although supplying components for a wide range of diesel locomotives and building a cab unit to test components for its universal series of road switchers, did not build for sale any cab units or end-cab yard switchers. GE entered the domestic railroad locomotive market in 1960 with the introduction of a 2,500 horsepower road switcher identified as a universal type. GE gave it the designation of U-25B. It was quickly identified by rail fans as a U-boat. The U-25B was the highest horsepower locomotive available when it was introduced. General Electric's marketing department had determined that in the 1960s, the railroads, when replacing first-generation diesels, were looking for higher horsepower units, locomotives that could take the place of two of the older models. The U-25B initiated a high horsepower race with both Locomotive and ALCO responding with higher horsepower locomotives that met or exceeded the U-25B. General Electric continued to evolve the universal road switchers, and by 1967 it was marketing the U-33 series with 3,300 horsepower. 2 years later, in 1969, it was marketing the U-36, a 3,600 horsepower locomotive, none of which were on the Penn Central roster. By 1968, General Electric's marketing department had determined that there was a need for a lower horsepower locomotive to respond to railroads that preferred a less powerful replacement alternative. To capture this market, General Electric introduced the 2,300 horsepower U-23B and U-23C, making General Electric a full competitor with both Locomotive and ALCO. In the following films and photographs, we'll take a more detailed look at the General Electric U-boats that were on the Penn Central roster, beginning with the U-23B. In 1972 and 1973, the Penn Central added 77 General Electric U-23Bs to the roster. Number 2700 was part of a second-generation lash-up heading an eastbound freight out of Chicago, Illinois in December of 1974. Number 2741 was the lead unit on an eastbound freight heading along the main line in Dalton, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. The photograph was also taken in December of 1974. The Penn Central was an early buyer of the General Electric 2300 horsepower U-23C, acquiring 24 locomotives following the merger. In these first two photographs, we see U-23C number 6702 coupled with a GP9B unit switching the freight yard in Buffalo, New York. The photographs were taken in September of 1971. In this film clip taken at the same time, we see U-23C number 6701, also coupled to a GP9B unit, switching the yard in Buffalo, New York. Number 6716 was the lone unit sitting on the ready track in the freight yard in Selkirk, New York, on this bright sunny day in August of 1974. The Penn Central had 191 of General Electric's original U-25B on their roster. 80 came from the New York Central, 85 came from the Pennsy, and 26 were inherited from the New Haven Railroad. In this August of 1970 photograph, taken in Dalton, Illinois, we see U-25B number 2521 as the middle unit on an all-General Electric freight heading eastbound out of Chicago. On a snowy day in December of 1973, we see U-25B number 2542 as the third unit in a four-unit lash-up, including an Locomotive F7. They were attached to a mixed freight, waiting for clearance to leave the yard eastbound out of Chicago. In these next two photographs, we get a chance to see a close-up of both sides of the U-25B. The photographs clearly illustrate the identifying feature of the U-25B, and that is a rise in the handrail near the end of the long hood. In each of the Universal series, General Electric offered a 4-motor or 6-motor alternative. The Penn Central had 17 of the 6-motor U-25C on its roster. All were former Pennsy units. In this February of 1976 photograph, we see U-25C number 6517 in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, at the head end of a westbound freight, waiting for clearance to leave the yard. The Penn Central owned both versions of the U-28, 22 former U-28Bs from the New York Central, and 15 U-28Cs, former Pennsy locomotives. In this September of 1972 photograph, we see U-28C number 6532 as the lead unit on a westbound freight, weaving its way through the switches in Buffalo, New York. In these next two photographs, we get an opportunity to see a close-up of both sides of the U-28C. General Electric introduced the 3,000 horsepower U-30B in December of 1966. The New York Central was one of the earliest buyers of the U-30B, receiving 58 units starting in February of 1967. All 58 units were on the Penn Central roster after the merger. U-30B number 2840 had been on the roster for 6 years when this photograph was taken in Chicago Freight Yard in August of 1973. U-30C number 6535, shown here in a photograph taken in Mingo Junction, Ohio in December of 1974, was one of only 5 U-30Cs on the Penn Central roster, all inherited from the Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1970, 2 years after the merger, the Penn Central bought 81 of GE's 3,300 horsepower U-33Bs. As seen by the exhaust, U-33B number 2927 is highballing eastbound past the commuter platform in Princeton Junction, New Jersey. The photograph was taken in August of 1971. Number 2921 was one of a 4-unit lash-up rolling through Dalton, Illinois with an eastbound freight in August of 1970. U-33B number 2925 is entering the Mingo Junction, Ohio yard in this April of 1974 photograph. In this 1972 film clip, we again see number 2925, this time leading a 4-unit lash-up of second-generation road switchers on an eastbound freight through Dalton, Illinois. The U-33C is the final road switcher in our review of General Electric locomotives on the Penn Central roster. The Penn Central purchased 24 of these 3,300 horsepower locomotives after the merger. All 24 of the U-33Cs were still on the roster and in revenue service at the time of the Conrail takeover. In this section, we will review the straight electric locomotives operated by the Penn Central. Following the merger, the Penn Central operated the former electric lines of the Pennsylvania and the New Haven railroads. From New Haven, Connecticut on the north, to Washington, D.C. on the south, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on the west. The electrified areas could be divided into 3 major components. The first was the main line from New York City through Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. The second was a portion of the main line between New York and Chicago and St. Louis, running between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, Harrisburg being the west end of the electrified district. The third was the electrified area of the former New Haven main line between New York City and Boston. At the time of the merger, the segment between New York and New Haven, Connecticut was the only portion of the line that was electrified. Since that time, the electrified area has been extended to Boston. The main line between Washington, D.C. and Boston became known as the Northeast Corridor and the location where Amtrak runs the high-speed rail service. The Penn Central was operating 7 different types of electric locomotives. Undoubtedly, the most well-known among rail fans was the famous GG1 locomotive. Originally designed in 1935 by Raymond Lowry, a famous industrial designer, the GG1 became the mainstay of Pennsylvania Railroad's electric power. The GG1s had been operating for more than 35 years when Amtrak took over the long-distance passenger trains of the nation. In these following film clips, we see the GG1s in operation. The GG1s were geared for 80 miles an hour, so several of the clips are run in slow motion to provide a better view of the locomotive. Although the GG1 was normally associated with passenger trains, as evidenced by this April of 1971 photograph taken in Princeton Junction, New Jersey, we see that the Penn Central operated them on high-speed freight trains as well. It is interesting to note that the GG1s always ran with the rear pantograph up. The reason being that in the unlikely event that the pantograph got tangled in the wires, it couldn't be ripped loose and destroy the second pantograph as well, making the engine inoperable. The Penn Central had 18 P2As on its roster, all former New York Central locomotives. The New York Central acquired them in 1929 and 1930 to operate on the electrified 3rd Rail District between New York City and Harmon, New York. Harmon, New York was the location where the New York Central exchanged electric locomotives for the diesel electrics that were prohibited from entering the New York Central electric zone. Following the merger, the Penn Central assumed the operations at Harmon and continued the exchanges of locomotives. P2B number 4622, shown here in Harmon, New York, in September of 1971, was the only P2B on the Penn Central roster. It was a former New York Central unit. 10 T3A electric locomotives were renumbered into the Penn Central system, but only 3 were repainted. The T3As were the oldest electric locomotives operated by the Penn Central. They were 46 years old at the time of the merger, having been purchased in September of 1926. There were 8 General Electric E40 type locomotives renumbered into the Penn Central system. All were former New Haven units, having been purchased in 1956. There were 38 E44s on the Penn Central roster, all former Pennsylvania units. They were the newest of the electric locomotives inherited by Penn Central. The Pennsylvania Railroad originally bought them in 1962 and 63. All 38 were still active and in revenue service when the Conrail takeover took place. In these next 3 film clips, all taken in Princeton Junction, New Jersey in the early 1970s, we see the E44s in action. We would like to thank you for buying our film and hope that you enjoyed watching it as much as we did putting it together. Thinking about the Penn Central, the Pennsy, and the New York Central brought back a lot of memories for us. The loss of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania railroads was a shock to those of us who were rail fans back in the middle years of the last century. During those years, it was not unusual for railroads to merge, or even in the case of the Rock Island, just stop operating. But the loss of both the Pennsy and the New York Central was a real shock. 2 giants of the industry and both rail fan favorites were gone. And for some reason, at least for the authors of this DVD, the Penn Central never seemed to fill the void. We hope you enjoyed our film. For us, it was a labor of love. As we have said many times in our DVDs, we are not filmmakers, we're rail fans that make films. The vast majority of the photos and all of the film clips come from our personal libraries. So as we catalog the visuals for this film, each photo and film seemed to bring back fond memories of what we like to say was the golden age of diesel rail fanning. Hopefully a picture or 2 brought back some good memories for you as well.